Somewhere deep inside a South African cave system, in a chamber so remote it can only be reached by squeezing through a crack barely wide enough for a human body, scientists found bones, ancient bones, arranged in a way that stopped researchers cold. Because if the evidence means what some scientists think it means, then roughly 300,000 years ago, a creature with a brain about the size of an orange was deliberately burying its dead. Think about what that would mean for everything we thought we knew. The standard story of human evolution has always had a kind of comfortable logic to it. Big brains came first. Language and complex thought followed. And only then, much later, did rituals emerge. Funerals, symbolism, the idea that death means something. That story puts intentional burial somewhere in the timeline of modern humans, creatures like us, with skulls full of cognitive horsepower and presumably the words to explain why they were doing what they were doing. But what if that timeline is wrong? What if something with a brain dramatically smaller than yours or mine was already grappling with death in ways we associate only with ourselves? That's not a minor revision to the textbooks. That's a fundamental rethinking of what makes us human and when those qualities actually appeared. Picture the scene. Not sunlight and open savanna. Instead, complete darkness, hundreds of feet underground, in a system of narrow passageways that seem almost designed to keep things out. And inside, fragile bones, carefully positioned, not scattered the way an animal or a flood would scatter them, not broken the way a predator would leave them, just there, waiting for someone to ask the right question, which is the hardest question in all of paleoanthropology. Was this intentional? Because that's where the mystery gets genuinely complicated. Intention leaves no fossil. You can find bones. You can measure them, date them, map exactly where they lay in the rock. What you cannot do is reach back 300,000 years and know what was happening inside another creature's mind when those bones got there. And that gap between what the evidence shows and what it actually proves is where this story lives. That gap is why scientists are still arguing about it right now. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. This is one of my favourite parts of making these. Last time I had people chiming in from Cape Town before sunrise and from Vancouver well past midnight, all watching the same story unfold at completely different moments of their day. What we're going to do in this video is walk through all of it together. The creature at the centre of this mystery, the cave itself, the discovery, the dating, the fierce scientific debate about what burial even means, and why this case refuses to be closed. Some of the explanations are fascinating, some of them are deeply unsettling, and one of them might completely change how you think about the human story. So who exactly is Homo naledi? Because before we can understand why this discovery is so disruptive, you need to know what kind of creature we're actually talking about. The name comes from the Sesotho word for star, naledi, because the cave system where the bones were found is called Rising Star. When researchers first started putting together a picture of this species from the recovered fossils, what they got back was something that didn't fit any existing category cleanly. Not a neat evolutionary step, not a missing link in the way science fiction likes to describe missing links. Something stranger and more interesting than that. Start with the brain. Homo naledi had a cranial capacity somewhere between 465 and 610 cubic centimeters. For comparison, you're walking around with somewhere around 1,350. A chimpanzee comes in at roughly 400. So naledi sits just slightly above our closest living relatives, i.e. closer to the chimp end of that spectrum than to ours. That's what people mean when they say tiny-brained, and by any conventional measure the term fits. But here's where you have to be careful. Brain size alone is a notoriously blunt instrument in paleoanthropology. We have been burned by it before. For most of the 20th century, researchers assumed that tool use, complex behaviour, and social sophistication scaled reliably with brain volume. Then we kept finding inconvenient evidence. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit of Indonesia, had a brain roughly the size of a grapefruit, and yet appears to have made sophisticated stone tools. Neanderthals had brains larger than modern humans on average, and were clearly capable of remarkable things. Brain organization, neural connectivity, and the ratio of different brain regions to each other matter enormously, and those details don't preserve in fossils. What we have for naledi is the outer shape of a skull. What we can't see is what was happening inside it. So when someone says tiny-brained, what they really mean is small-skulled. The cognitive story is more complicated and much less settled. What makes naledi genuinely strange isn't just the skull, it's the whole package. The body plan is what paleoanthropologists call mosaic, meaning different parts of the skeleton look like they belong to creatures from completely different points in evolutionary time. The feet are almost indistinguishable from modern human feet, highly adapted for upright walking with a pronounced arch, a fully aligned big toe, the kind of structure that suggests naledi was spending serious time moving efficiently across the ground. The lower limbs confirm this. Hip and leg proportions are consistent with a habitual biped, someone who walked the way we walk. Then you look at the hands and something shifts. The fingers are curved. Not dramatically, not like a chimpanzee's, but curved enough to suggest that climbing was still part of the behavioural repertoire. The shoulders are oriented in a way that is more primitive than ours, built for the kind of overhead reaching and hauling you'd need if trees were still part of daily life. The ribcage flares outward in a way that looks more like early Australopithecus than anything in the genus Homo. The skull and brain case we've already covered, small with some distinctly archaic features in its shape. So what you're looking at is a creature that appears to have been a capable groundwalker who could also move through the trees, one that had ancient features in its upper body and surprisingly modern features from the waist down. This isn't a creature caught between two stages in a simple linear progression. It's a creature that had its own evolutionary history, its own adaptive pressures, and its own solutions to the problem of survival in southern Africa. Evolution doesn't march forward in a straight line. It branches, backtracks, and occasionally produces something that looks like a remix of features from across the family tree. Where does naledi fit among the other humans? This is where the story gets provocative. For a long time, small brain and primitive skeletal features together would have put a hominin in the very early chapters of the human story, 2 or 3 million years ago, contemporaries of the Australopiths. But the bones found in Rising Star Cave have been dated to somewhere between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. That puts Homo naledi alive at the same time as early Homo sapiens in Africa, at roughly the same time as Neanderthals in Europe, at roughly the same time as the Denisovans in Asia. This was not an ancestor we can comfortably point to as a stepping stone toward modern humans. This was a cousin, a small-brained, mosaic-bodied, anatomically bewildering cousin, living alongside more derived human species, possibly even in overlapping territories. That raises uncomfortable questions about competition, about contact, about what was actually happening on the African continent during a period we thought we had reasonably well mapped. Turns out the map had a significant gap in it. Now a word of caution about all of this, because the fossil record for naledi, while extraordinary in terms of the sheer number of individual specimens recovered, still has real limitations. More than 1,500 bone fragments have been recovered, representing at least 15 individuals. For paleoanthropology, that's a remarkable sample size. Most species in our family tree are known from a handful of fragments, but 15 individuals is still 15 individuals. They may or may not represent the full range of variation within the species. Some skeletons are more complete than others. Age at death, sex, and health status vary across the sample in ways that create noise in the data. Every measurement, every reconstruction, Every behavioural inference rests on this finite and incomplete foundation. There's also the sampling bias problem that haunts all fossil interpretation. We know about Homo naledi because its bones ended up in a very specific cave in South Africa, in conditions that happened to preserve them. We have no idea how many other populations existed, how geographically widespread they were, whether the individuals found in Rising Star are typical of the species, or whether they represent some unusual subgroup. Fossils don't give you a census. They give you a handful of moments frozen in rock, and you do your best to extrapolate from them. What we can say with confidence is this: Homo naledi was real. It was distinct. It was small-brained by the standards of its era. It had a body built from parts that seemed to belong to different chapters of the evolutionary story, and it was alive far more recently than anyone expected when the first bones came out of that cave. Everything beyond that, the behaviour, the cognition, the social life, is inference built on evidence. Some of that evidence is genuinely compelling. Some of it is hotly disputed, and all of it leads back to the question that started this whole thing. Why are there bones arranged in a remote underground chamber, and how did they get there? To answer that question, you have to understand the place, because the cave isn't just where this story happened. In a very real sense, the cave is why this story happened at all. Rising Star is part of a vast underground limestone network about 50 kilometres northwest of Johannesburg, in a region of South Africa called the Cradle of Humankind. That name isn't just poetic. This stretch of dolomitic terrain is riddled with cave systems, and those caves have been producing hominin fossils for nearly a century. Australopithecus africanus came out of this region. So did Paranthropus robustus. The geology here is almost absurdly generous to paleoanthropologists. Limestone dissolves, caves form, bones fall in, calcite seals over them, and millions of years later someone with a headlamp finds them. The cradle has a track record. But Rising Star is different from the other sites in ways that matter enormously for what we're trying to figure out. Yeah, most of the fossil-bearing caves in the region function as natural traps. An animal falls in through a surface opening, can't get out, dies, and the bones accumulate. Simple, tragic, mechanically predictable. Rising Star doesn't work like that. Getting to the chamber where the naledi bones were found isn't a matter of falling in. It's a matter of choosing to go deeper, repeatedly, through passages that actively resist you. Here's the geography. The entrance to the system is manageable enough, a slot in the hillside that a person can squeeze through. But to reach the Dinaledi Chamber, where the majority of the fossils were recovered, you have to navigate roughly 80 metres of increasingly hostile underground terrain. At one point you encounter a section called the Superman's Crawl, named because you have to extend one arm forward and drag yourself through with almost no vertical clearance. Then comes the Dragon's Back, a sharp-edged rock formation you have to climb up and over, and then, most critically, there's a near-vertical chute called the Chute, 15 centimetres at its narrowest, 12 metres long, pointed almost straight down. Getting through it requires a body no wider than a small adult's shoulders and a willingness to descend headfirst into darkness, with no guarantee of what's on the other side. The modern researchers who excavated this site recruited a specific team of scientists, all of them slender, all of them experienced cavers, because there was genuinely no other way to get the work done. This wasn't a logistical inconvenience. Yeah, it was a fundamental feature of the site that shapes every single interpretation of the evidence. Because if it's this difficult for modern humans equipped with electric lights, climbing harnesses, and advanced knowledge of the layout, what does it mean that Homo naledi apparently got there, possibly more than once? This is where the cave stops being just a backdrop and starts being part of the argument itself. Caves preserve things beautifully. That's the upside. Stable temperatures, protection from surface weathering, low oxygen environments in deep chambers, all of these conditions slow the processes that destroy organic material. The Dinaledi Chamber contained more than 1,500 bone fragments representing at least 15 individuals. They were in remarkable condition, and far better than you'd expect from fossils this old. The cave did its job as a preserving vault, but caves also lie. Not intentionally, obviously, but depositional processes underground can move, sort and concentrate material in ways that mimic deliberate arrangement. Water flows through cave systems and carries bones with it, sometimes depositing them in tidy clusters that look purposeful and aren't. Calcite formations trap objects and hold them in positions that seem significant. Small chambers with a single entrance can accumulate material over thousands of years until the concentration looks intentional, when actually all you're seeing is the mathematics of a one-way funnel. So the sheer number of naledi remains in the Dinaledi Chamber cuts both ways. On one hand, the concentration is striking. 15 individuals is not a number you get from random bone scatter. On the other hand, if a space has one entrance and no exit, things that go in tend to stay in. The question isn't just how many bones are there. The question is how they got there, and whether the cave's geometry is telling you something real or playing a trick on your pattern-seeking brain. What makes the puzzle genuinely difficult is that the leading alternative explanations all have problems of their own. If this was a natural trap, where are the other species? Death traps collect indiscriminately. Pit caves across the cradle of humankind contain the bones of dozens of different animals that had the bad luck to fall in. The Dinaledi Chamber is overwhelmingly naledi. A few owl pellet fragments, some rodent bones, but nothing suggesting the kind of multi-species catastrophe a passive trap would produce. That's odd. That demands explanation. If the bones were washed in by ancient water flows, where's the sorting pattern? Water transport leaves signatures in the fossil record. Smaller bones move more easily than larger ones. Bones orient themselves along current lines. The naledi material doesn't show the patterns you'd expect from hydraulic deposition. It shows something different, and that difference is what researchers keep arguing about. Which brings you to the idea that has made this site so controversial. What if the remains in the Dinaledi Chamber got there because naledi brought them there? Not once, not by accident, but repeatedly. Over time, with intent. That's the hypothesis sitting at the centre of all the noise. It implies navigation of that impossible passage in complete darkness. It implies motivation beyond simple survival. It implies, if you follow the logic far enough, something that a creature with a 500 cubic centimetre brain was not supposed to be capable of. And the cave, frustratingly, beautifully, keeps all of its secrets just out of reach. The story starts, like a lot of science does, with something that at first looked small. In 2013, 2 recreational cavers were exploring Rising Star. They knew the cradle region was fossil-rich, but this wasn't some organised expedition with a research team behind it. They were just pushing into tight spaces, seeing how far they could get. Then, deep inside the system, down that absurdly narrow chute, they reached the chamber you've just heard about. On the floor and in the sediment, they spotted bones, not bat bones, not the scattered remains of modern animals, fossil bone, old bone, and crucially, bones that didn't look like anything they were used to seeing. They showed their finds to paleoanthropologist Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand. Berger had already made a name for himself in the cradle with earlier discoveries, but this was different. The photographs and initial fragments suggested hominin material in a place that was practically inaccessible. If that impression was right, it was a jackpot and a nightmare at the same time. You can't ignore hominin fossils, but you also can't magic them out of a chamber that most people physically cannot reach. So Berger did something that would shape not just the science, but the entire public story around Homo naledi. He went to Facebook, seriously. He posted an open call for scientists who are not only trained in paleoanthropology or related fields, but who were also small enough and skilled enough as cavers to get through the chute. It read a little like a mission briefing for a heist movie. Must be slender, must not be claustrophobic, must be willing to work in extreme conditions underground. 6 women were ultimately selected. They became known as the underground astronauts, professional scientists who just happened to have the right body type and caving experience to squeeze where almost nobody else could. Above ground, a larger team prepared to receive whatever they could bring back. Then the real work started. Excavating a normal site is already a meticulous, almost obsessive process. You grid the area, you record the position of every bone fragment, you map the layers. You photograph constantly. You try to preserve context because context is often more informative than any single fossil. Now take that level of care and cram it into a pitch-black chamber, reached by sliding 12 meters down a rock chute the width of a laptop. Add the fact that you can't just stand up, stretch, or bring in heavy gear. Every tool has to be small, every movement controlled. If you drop something, retrieving it is non-trivial. If you kick sediment in the wrong direction, you might disturb material that has been perfectly undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years. The team set up a kind of 2-level operation. Underground, the astronauts worked in confined space, carefully exposing bone from the sediment with small tools, sometimes literally lying on their sides to reach awkward angles. They documented positions. They noted orientations, recorded microstratigraphy. They bagged and tagged fragments according to exact recovery locations. Above ground, in a command center near the cave, other scientists watched via cameras and head-mounted lights, directing, advising, logging. The chamber became a live feed. It wasn't just physically hard science. It was science performed under surveillance, in real time, with a growing sense that they were uncovering something far bigger than they had expected. Because the bones didn't stop coming. From that first season alone, the team recovered more than 1,500 fossil elements. That's an enormous number by paleoanthropological standards. Hominin finds are usually trickles, one jaw here, a partial skull there. Rising Star was a flood. Those 1,500 fragments represented at least 15 individuals, and that was just what could be confidently counted from overlapping skeletal parts. The real number may be higher. There were adults, there were juveniles. There was at least one very young child. Almost every part of the skeleton was represented. Skull fragments, vertebrae, ribs, teeth, long bones of arms and legs, tiny bones of hands and feet. Just as important as what was there was what wasn't. There were almost no large mammal bones, no big predators, no antelope or zebra skeletons, no big carnivore gnaw marks all over the hominin bones. This wasn't your classic pit trap assemblage. It was overwhelmingly Homo naledi, with a scattering of small animal remains that looked incidental, not like core participants in the story. The distribution inside the chamber had its own pattern. Bones weren't all jumbled as if bodies had been swept in by a raging underground river. There were clusters, partial articulations, areas where certain types of elements concentrated. Some bones showed signs of slight movement after deposition, but not the kind of sorting you'd expect from strong water flow or catastrophic collapse. As the team mapped every fragment and plotted them against the chamber geometry, a weird picture emerged. The Dinaledi Chamber wasn't just a place where a few naledi had died. It looked like a place where their remains had accumulated over time. Back in the lab, the surprises continued. The anatomy of the bones didn't line up cleanly with any known species. The skulls were small, with brain volumes closer to Australopithecines than to modern humans, around 465 to 610 cubic centimeters. The shoulders and upper torso were more primitive, suggesting powerful climbing abilities, but the feet looked strikingly modern. The hands were a mashup, curved fingers like a climber, but wrists and thumbs that looked adapted for precise manipulation, even tool use. When the first papers were announced in 2015, the team gave this mosaic creature a name, Homo naledi. At that point they still didn't have a precise age. The bones weren't yet firmly dated. All they had were relationships, anatomy that looked primitive in some ways, derived in others, and a context in a deep, inaccessible chamber with no obvious natural trap mechanism. That context is what lit the fuse. In their initial publications and press briefings, Berger and his colleagues floated a bold hypothesis. Maybe, just maybe, the reason there were so many naledi individuals in that one hard-to-reach chamber was because other naledi had put them there. Deliberately. They were careful with wording. They talked about deliberate body disposal rather than full-blown ritual burial. They noted that there were no cut marks, no clear grave goods, no dug pits with obvious backfill, but they emphasized the cave geometry, the scarcity of other animals, the lack of transport signatures. Taken together, they argued, the simplest explanation might be that bodies were being brought into the chamber and left there over time. And that suggestion dropped into paleoanthropology like a grenade. If they were right, it would mean that a species with a brain about a third the size of ours, living perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago, had developed some kind of consistent mortuary behaviour. Not an accidental pile-up, not a few individuals stumbling in and getting trapped. A patterned practice. Carry your dead into the darkness and leave them in a specific place. That idea threatens a lot of quiet assumptions. For decades, many researchers have treated complex mortuary behaviour, especially anything resembling deliberate placement of bodies, as a kind of cognitive threshold, something that arrives with large-brained humans and perhaps Neanderthals, signalling an ability to think symbolically about death, group identity, maybe even an afterlife. In that framework, burials are mile markers on the road to us. Homo naledi drove a truck right through that neat narrative. If small-brained hominins were engaging in selective body disposal deep in a cave, then maybe the connection between brain size and sophisticated social behaviour isn't as rigid as we've wanted it to be. Maybe symbolic thought, or something that looks a lot like it, evolved multiple times, in parallel, in different packages. Or maybe we've been misreading what burial actually means. The speed and style of the Naledi publications magnified the controversy. Instead of quietly circulating among specialists for years before leaking into public consciousness, this discovery unfolded almost in real time. The open call for cavers had already drawn media attention. The notion of underground astronauts was inherently cinematic. When the team announced not just a new species but a provocative behavioural interpretation at the same time, accompanied by high-profile press conferences and open-access papers, the global reaction was immediate. Some scientists were excited. They saw the Rising Star project as a model for open, rapid, collaborative science. Others were sceptical, even angry. They argued that the burial claims were premature, that the data were being oversold, that alternatives like subtle water transport or unknown cave dynamics hadn't been ruled out. Underneath that professional back and forth, there was a deeper tension. This wasn't just about how bones got into a cave. It was about the boundaries of human behaviour. Yeah, how much brain do you need to care what happens to a dead group member? To carry a body into the dark? To treat death as something that demands a response beyond opportunistic scavenging or simple avoidance? Homo naledi landed right on that fault line. The Rising Star team's interpretations forced everyone to confront a possibility many had quietly assumed away, that the mental world of other hominins might have been far richer and far stranger than our neat evolutionary ladder diagrams suggest. And if that's true, then the story of burial, of what it means to place a body with intent, suddenly becomes much harder to use as a clean dividing line between us and them. Before anyone could decide how radical that implication really was, though, there was a more basic question to answer. How old were these bones exactly? And dating things inside caves sounds straightforward. You find a bone, you test it, a machine spits out a number, and boom, mystery solved. Rising star is what happens when reality refuses to play along. When the Naledi papers first came out, the age question hung over everything. If these small-brained hominins were doing something unusual with their dead, when, exactly, were they doing it? Were they living alongside early Homo sapiens? Were they older than Neanderthals? Did they belong to some deep archaic chapter of human evolution? Or were they late survivors of an ancient line? You can't answer that by looking at the bones alone. You have to date the entire context. And in caves, context is messy. To make sense of the numbers, you have to understand what scientists are actually dating down there. There are the bones themselves, of course. Those can sometimes be dated directly using methods like uranium series dating, which measures how radioactive uranium and its decay products move in and out of bone over time. In theory, that gives you an age since burial, but bones breathe the cave, they absorb and lose minerals, water percolates, chemistry changes. If uranium moved in long after the body decomposed, the clock starts late. If it leached out, the clock gets scrambled. Direct dates can be hints or traps. Then there's the sediment the bones are buried in. Those grains, tiny bits of rock and dust, can sometimes be dated with techniques like optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. That method asks, when was this grain of sand last exposed to sunlight? When it got buried, its internal light meter reset. Measure how much signal is built up since. And you can estimate when the sediment settled into place. That helps, but only if the sediment hasn't been disturbed. If later water flow shifted grains around, if pockets got reworked, the age of burial you get might be the age of some later rearrangement, not the original event you care about. On top of that, there are the rocks the cave makes itself, flowstones and stalagmites. These are the smooth, often shiny layers laid down by mineral-rich water as it trickles along floors and walls. You can date these with uranium-thorium techniques fairly reliably. But here's the trick. Flowstones don't tell you when a bone fell to the ground. They tell you when mineral layers grew above or below that bone. A flowstone sealing a layer of fossils gives you a minimum age. The fossils must be older than the cap on top. A flowstone underlying a fossil layer gives you a maximum age. The fossils must be younger than the rock they're resting on, so you get a bracketing game. Bones older than this, younger than that, more or less. In Rising Star, all of these clocks were ticking at once and not always in harmony. Early on, before detailed dating, many researchers assumed Naledi had to be old. The small brain, the primitive shoulders, the mixture of features that looked more at home with hominins from over 1 million years ago, all of that pushed expectations back in time. People quietly slotted Naledi into a mental box labelled somewhere between early Homo and maybe Erectus. Then the actual numbers started to come in. When Berger's team and collaborators finally published a suite of dates in 2017, the range they proposed landed with a jolt, roughly between about 335,000 and 236,000 years ago for the Dinaledi Chamber material. Instead of being a million-year-old relic, Homo naledi suddenly looked like a mid-Pleistocene contemporary. That range is important, not 300,000 years ago, as if it were a single birthday, but a span of about 100,000 years in which these bones likely accumulated. That's how cave time works. Bodies don't all arrive on one Tuesday. They show up one by one over generations against a background of slow dripstone growth and gradual sediment infill. Different methods in the chamber pulled in slightly different directions. Some uranium series dates from the bones lean toward the younger or older ends. Some luminescence dates from sediments suggested when particular layers stopped seeing daylight. Flowstones above and below fossil-bearing layers gave broad ceilings and floors for the whole package. You can picture the team pinning all these numbers to a timeline and then drawing a thick translucent band through the overlap. Inside the band, the most plausible window for naledi in that chamber. Outside, ages that would require more special pleading. That band, roughly around 300,000 years ago, give or take, is the number you've probably heard. But the wiggle room matters more than the slogan, because the behavioural argument lives in that wiggle room. Why? Because of who else is walking around Africa at those times. By about 300,000 years ago, we're no longer in a world of mysterious, we're primitive, almost humans fumbling toward modernity. We're in a world where early Homo sapiens-like populations are emerging. The fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, for example, date to around 315,000 years ago and show a blend of archaic and modern features. Other African sites suggest a patchwork of evolving populations experimenting with what would eventually become us. So if naledi really were inhabiting Rising Star roughly between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago, they weren't just some ancient prelude. They were neighbours, one of several hominin lineages sharing the continent with early forms of us. That's the part that makes people's eyebrows climb. Because if you have small-brained Homo naledi possibly placing bodies deep in a cave at roughly the same time that larger-brained, more modern-looking humans are emerging elsewhere in Africa, the easy story that big brains invented complex behaviour full stop starts to fray. Push the dates older and you get a different kind of shock. If naledi were, say, 500,000 or 800,000 years old, the behaviour in the cave would look even more precocious. Early experimentation with body disposal long before anything similar shows up in the Neanderthal or modern human fossil record. Nudge them younger, toward 200,000 years or below, and naledi become late survivors, hanging on in pockets of southern Africa while other lineages spread, arguably reinforcing the picture of behavioural diversity among coexisting humans. Either way, the behavioural question keeps biting. Changing the date range shifts who their contemporaries are. It changes which chapters of human evolution naledi overlap with. But it doesn't let anyone relax into a simple narrative. The fact that different dating methods sometimes point to slightly different answers is exactly why scientists lean so hard on cross-checking. If the bones, the sediments, and the flowstones all independently agree within a narrow era, confidence rises. If one of them refuses to match the others, you dig deeper, literally and figuratively, into the cave's geological history. Caves are dynamic. Passages open and close. Water finds new routes, then abandons them. Sediments can slump. A layer that looks neat and simple to human eyes might record multiple pulses of deposition and erosion. Every date has to be interpreted not as the age of the cave, but as the age of this specific process at this specific point in this wildly complicated underground system. That complexity is not a bug, it's the data. A flowstone that seals a fossil layer tells you there was a point when mineral buildup shut down access to that surface. A sediment lens that cuts across another layer tells you something disturbed the floor at some later time. A bone with one uranium series age sitting in sediment that seems somewhat older or younger raises questions about how long that bone lay exposed before burial. From a distance, all of this can sound like arguing over technicalities, but the stakes are clear. If naledi really are sitting in that mid-Pleistocene window, they belong in the same rough time frame as the early emergence of Homo sapiens and other advanced African tool traditions. If they're older, they become pioneers of something we didn't think existed yet. If they're younger, they become stubborn holdouts of an ancient way of being human, doing weirdly modern things with oddly primitive brains. What none of those options do is make the Dinaledi Chamber boring. Every new set of dates and reanalyses so far has been met with the same pattern. Headlines suggesting the puzzle is now finally solved, and then, in the fine print, enough uncertainty to keep the debate alive. The Rising Star team leans into a late-surviving, behaviourally interesting naledi. Some critics argue for more caution, pointing to the spread of dates and the quirks of cave stratigraphy. Others are busy refining models and collecting new data, hoping to squeeze that broad band of possibility just a little tighter. But even if we eventually narrow the age range by tens of thousands of years, the core discomfort will remain. We already know that, around 300,000 years ago, Africa was home to multiple hominin lineages. We already know that brain size alone doesn't map neatly onto behaviour. We already know that caves are treacherous storytellers, mixing processes and time. So when you hear Homo naledi about 300,000 years ago, it's less a final verdict and more like a GPS dot on a fuzzy map. Close enough to anchor the narrative, yet messy enough that any firm conclusion about what these beings should have been capable of becomes risky. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. Once you place naledi in time, more or less, you still have to decide what exactly they were doing in that cave, which means we need to talk about what actually counts as a burial. So, what actually counts as a burial? It sounds like a simple category. You dig a hole, put a body in, cover it up. Burial, done. But in archaeology, nothing is ever that clean. When scientists talk about burials, they're not just talking about a body ending up underground. Bodies end up underground all the time without any help from culture. Floods, rockfalls, mudslides, predator dens, sinkholes, cave collapses, they're all nature's burial services. So archaeologists set the bar higher. A burial, in the technical sense, usually means three overlapping things. First, intentional placement. The body's position suggests someone decided where it should go and how it should lie. That might mean a body laid on its back with limbs tucked or curled on its side in a consistent pose. It often means the skeleton is still articulated. Bones are still connected the way they were in life, not jumbled by scavengers or water. Second, a feature. Not just the dirt it happened to be in, but a recognizable structure. A pit, a hollow, a cut into the existing surface that looks different from the natural layers around it. In open-air sites, this might be a clear, shovel-shaped depression, filled with sediment that stands out in colour or texture. In caves, it might be a scooped-out basin, a modified niche, or an area of disturbed sediments that doesn't match background processes. Third, patterning. One body in a weird spot can be a fluke. 10 bodies treated in broadly similar ways in the same restricted space, over time, that starts to smell like culture. Repeated use of the same area for putting the dead similar body positions, maybe even associated objects placed in consistent ways. That combination, intentional placement, a feature, and repeated patterning, is what lets archaeologists talk confidently about burial practices, rather than one strange corpse in a cave. Even then, there's a catch. Not all burials are ritual burials in the sense that we think of funerals today. And that's where the line between simple body disposal and symbolic behaviour starts to blur. Imagine a group that wants to get rid of the smell, the flies, and the risk of predators being drawn to the camp. They might drag bodies into a nearby crevice, or always push them into the same chamber, or dump them down a convenient shaft. No prayers, no beliefs about an afterlife, just sanitation, and maybe a desire not to look at the dead. Is that a burial? From a purely archaeological perspective, it might look very similar to what we, as modern humans, would call a ceremonial act. Intentional placement? Yes. Repeated use of the same area? Yes. Bodies relatively intact, tucked into a confined space? Yes. The bones don't come with subtitles. They don't tell you whether the people doing this believed in souls or ghosts or cosmic journeys. All you see is the pattern. That's why many researchers now distinguish between mortuary behaviour in general, all the ways organisms deal with dead bodies, and symbolic ritual, which implies meaning, representation, concepts that go beyond the immediate practical problem of a corpse. But the evidence you get in the ground is mostly the same kind of thing, where the bones are, how they lie, what the sediments around them look like, and whether anything else was put there on purpose. So what do scientists actually look for when they make that call? One big clue is articulation. Skeletons don't stay neatly put together for long if nature is left in charge. When a body dies on the surface, soft tissues decompose, ligaments decay, and bones start to fall apart. Scavengers tug limbs away. Rodents chew. Water flow moves small elements first. Finger and toe bones. Teeth, ribs. If you find a skeleton in a natural context that hasn't been buried quickly, you expect disarticulation. The spine might be scattered. The hands and feet might be missing or spread out. The skull may roll a bit downhill from the body. Over time, you get a loose jumble rather than a complete anatomy. Burials interrupt that process. Covering a body with sediment or placing it in a protected pocket of the cave can shield it from scavengers and from some physical disturbances. The result is a skeleton that stays mostly together, sometimes in very specific poses. Legs flexed, arms crossed, head propped in a particular place. So when researchers see multiple individuals in a site whose bones are still in natural anatomical order, vertebrae stacked, ribs cupping the chest, hands sitting where hands should be, that's a strong hint that the bodies were placed and protected relatively quickly after death. Another key line of evidence is sediment disturbance, what archaeologists call grave cuts. Natural deposits usually layer up like slow-motion lasagna. Floods lay down coarse silt, then fine dust settles, then a different colour of sediment arrives in the next event. Burrowing animals can mess this up locally, but you still expect some internal logic to the layers. Dig a pit and you slice through that logic. You cut down through multiple existing layers, then refill the hole with a mix of whatever you scooped out plus any new material that gets thrown in with the body. When you later excavate that area carefully, you might see a kind of inverted scar, a column or basin where the sediment looks jumbled compared to the neat horizons around it. In open sites with good preservation, archaeologists can literally trace the outline of grave cuts, the edges of the hole, the base, the fill pattern. In caves it's harder, sediments are patchier, and later water flow can blur the edges. But people still look for anomalies, zones where grain sizes, colours or compaction change suddenly around a body, suggesting someone once dug, placed and refilled. Then there's context. Are there stones arranged around or over the body in ways that look non-random? Is the corpse lying on a deliberately prepared surface, a bed of pebbles, a layer of ash, a compacted floor? Are there artifacts that don't match normal living debris, objects that seem to have been placed with the body rather than just dropped and swept aside? None of this is decisive alone. A tight articulation without a clear pit might still be natural if, for example, a body fell into a sheltered crevice and dried out before decomposing. A disturbed sediment patch might be an animal burrow instead of a grave. A stone near a skull might just be a stone near a skull. That's where taphonomy comes in, the science of what happens to an organism after death. Taphonomists are basically crime scene analysts for deep time. They study how bones break under different forces, how weathering stages progress in various environments, how water, gravity, animals, and even plant roots move skeletal elements around. They know that surface bones bleach and crack in characteristic ways. They know that gnaw marks from carnivores look different from rodent chewing, and both look different from stone tool cut marks or trampling damage. They know that in a collapsing cave roof you might get bodies crushed and fragmented in a specific direction, while in a quiet pond bones might settle in calm layered patterns. In caves, taphonomy is especially intricate. Bodies might come in whole and later be shifted by slurry flows. They might dry out on a ledge, lose some small bones, then slump as the sediment underneath compacts. Dripping water might break fragile elements, but leave robust bones intact. Earthquakes can tilt entire packages of sediment, making originally horizontal bodies appear angled or even standing. So when someone claims this is deliberate burial, other scientists immediately start running through the taphonomic playbook. Could water have put the body there? Could a collapse have concentrated bones in that spot? Could animal activity explain the missing or moved parts? Are the breaks fresh from the time of death, or old from later pressure? Every alternative natural pathway has to be stress-tested before intentional burial becomes the most economical explanation. And this is where the old rule kicks in. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary here doesn't mean paranormal, it means strongly counter to our current expectations. A small-brained, archaic-looking hominin intentionally placing bodies deep inside a cave is extraordinary compared to the rest of the Pleistocene record we have so far. It's not impossible. It's just surprising enough that the evidence has to clear a high bar. One striking detail, a single neatly posed skeleton, one suspiciously tidy cluster of bones, one unusual sediment patch, won't do it on its own. You want layers of support that converge from different angles. You want multiple individuals, not just one, showing signs of rapid protected placement. You want the sediment around them to tell the same story as the bones. Disruption consistent with digging or repeated traffic, not random wash. You want the damage patterns on the skeletons to scream, "We decomposed in place," rather than "we got smashed and transported." If you're going to argue for symbolism, you'd like to see associated materials, objects that don't make sense there unless someone meant them to be part of the event. Yeah, the puzzle of Rising Star lives in those layers, or in the places where they're missing. Proponents of naledi burials point to articulation, to clustering, to the absence of obvious natural delivery routes. Skeptics point to the lack of clear grave cuts, to the complexity of cave taphonomy, to how easily nature can mimic order when you only see the final snapshot. Before you can decide who's closer to the truth, you have to see exactly what the bones in that cave are doing. So now that we've drawn the line, however fuzzy, between natural deposition, simple body disposal and full-on burial, we can finally turn to Rising Star itself. What does the Dinaledi Chamber actually show? And how strong is the case that Homo naledi were intentionally putting their dead there? The case starts with the place itself. The Dinaledi Chamber is not a casual destination. To get there from the cave entrance, you move through a maze of passages, then squeeze down a chute so narrow that in some spots it's barely wider than a human chest. Modern cavers describe it as one of the most claustrophobic routes they've ever taken. You don't just wander into this space by accident. For the researchers arguing that Homo naledi deliberately placed their dead, that single fact carries a lot of weight. If there's no easy natural chute, no underground stream, no vertical shaft that would conveniently funnel bodies into the chamber, then every individual found there has to be explained. One or two could be a fluke, a trapped animal, a bad fall, a group caught in a sudden collapse. But Rising Star doesn't give you one or two. The Dinaledi Chamber holds the remains of at least 15 individuals, probably more. Infants, children, adults, old individuals, a spread of ages and both sexes, all represented in one confined, hard-to-reach space. That's the first plank of the pro-intentional argument. Access. If small-brained hominins were repeatedly getting into this chamber, They either had an uncanny knack for getting lost in exactly the same horrifying way, over and over, across generations, or they knew the route, they remembered it, they chose it, and that over and over part is critical. From the pattern of bones and sediments, many researchers infer that the bodies didn't all arrive at once. They don't look like a single mass death event. Instead, anatomy suggests multiple episodes of deposition separated in time, bodies placed, left to decompose, then later disturbed slightly as new individuals joined them. If that's right, then we're not just looking at one disaster, we're looking at repeated behaviour. Repeated behaviour in a place like this implies some heavy cognitive lifting. It means individuals remembered the path down through the cave network. It means they were capable of guiding others, because you don't carry a dead child or assist an elderly group member through that maze alone. It suggests coordination, someone leading, someone following, maybe others waiting near the entrance. You don't get repeated use of a deep chamber without some kind of social consensus that this is where the bodies go. That idea, root memory, purposeful return, group coordination, is exactly what excites the researchers making the intentional placement case. Imagine what it means in practice. A member of the group dies. The living have a choice. They could leave the body where it fell. They could drag it a short distance away from the sleeping area. They could abandon the site altogether and move camp. Instead, time after time, they seem to have taken the more difficult option, transporting bodies, whole or mostly whole, down into the dark through a complex, risky passage system into a specific chamber that doesn't provide food, water or shelter. A place useful for one thing only, containing the dead. That's the second plank of the argument, pattern consistency. Inside Dinaledi, Homo naledi remains are packed into a surprisingly small zone. They're not smeared across every recess of the cave. They're not randomly scattered by water. They cluster in particular areas, in sediments that don't scream violent transport. Some individuals show high degrees of articulation, vertebrae still stacked, hands and feet with many of their tiny bones in roughly the right order, ribs still cupping empty space where lungs once were. Those articulations suggest the bodies decomposed largely where they were found, relatively undisturbed by scavengers or currents. That fits with the idea that this secluded chamber functioned as a kind of body repository, a place where corpses went and then stayed. From that point, some of the researchers go further. They argue that we might be seeing not just placement, but something closer to a burial pit. In a few areas, the sediments around certain skeletons look different, looser, more mixed, with hints of subtle depressions. Some bones appear to sit in shallow scoops, yet their outlines slightly lower than the surrounding cave floor. There have been claims of basin-like features, of zones where the body lies in what could be a deliberately modified hollow rather than simply on top of an untouched surface. If those interpretations hold up under scrutiny, they would suggest that naledi weren't just depositing bodies. They might have been preparing the ground, excavating small pits or scooping out sediment with hands or tools, placing the dead, then at least partially covering them. Nobody is claiming deep, coffin-shaped graves with perfect grave cuts and clear fill boundaries. The features, if real, are subtle. But even a shallow depression is significant. It takes planning. You have to imagine the body in that spot before it's actually there. You have to expend energy modifying the environment for a corpse. In humans and Neanderthals, such features are often interpreted as part of a burial practice. Extending that label to Homo naledi is controversial, but that's precisely why the suggestion is so charged. What's striking about the case for intentional placement in Dinaledi is that it does not need religion to be extraordinary. You can strip the motive down to something brutally simple, and it's still remarkable. Start with the most practical reasons to move a body: hygiene, Decomposing tissue attracts insects, spreads pathogens, contaminates water sources. Predators. The smell of death can draw carnivores straight to your camp. Defense. A rotting corpse is a beacon advertising your location to everything with a good nose and sharp teeth. And comfort. The psychological aversion to sleeping next to a decaying group member might not require elaborate beliefs, just a basic emotional response. If Homo naledi understood, even in a rough experience-based way, that dead bodies near where we live lead to bad things, then they had a clear incentive to get those bodies away from their main activity areas. But where do you put them? In an open landscape, you could drag them to ravines, toss them into thorn thickets, abandon them on distant rocks. In a cave-rich environment, a deep chamber like Dinaledi is a powerful solution. Cool, enclosed, hard to reach. It muffles smells, hides remains from scavengers, and keeps the dead out of sight. You don't need an afterlife belief to explain that choice. You just need a memory of consequence. Every time we left bodies near camp, something bad happened. Every time we used that deep, dark place, fewer bad things did. Over generations, such a practice could become a social rule. When someone dies, we take them there. No one has to recite a theology, it's just what you do. Even that just what you do scenario implies quite a lot about naledi minds. It requires them to recognize dead as a distinct, persistent state different from sleep or injury. Treat that state consistently across group members, not just for one special individual. Coordinate multiple people for a logistically challenging task. Remember and transmit a specific behavioral pattern across generations. None of those steps, individually, demand symbolic art or explicit language as we know it, but taken together, they point to something like a shared rule system, a proto-tradition anchored in social cohesion. Because body disposal is never purely practical. The moment you decide that the dead of your group are handled differently from the carcasses of prey animals, you're drawing a line between us and everything else. Even if your only articulated motive, if you could have voiced it, would have been so they don't stink up camp, the act still reinforces who counts as one of us. Dragging a dead group member through a terrifying chute into utter darkness isn't neutral work. Someone carries the weight, others watch, follow, maybe help maneuver the body around tight corners. There is effort, shared risk, shared time devoted to a corpse instead of foraging, resting, or grooming. That investment builds and reflects social bonds. Then this is what fascinates scientists about the rising star evidence, even when they deliberately avoid words like funeral or ritual. If Homo naledi really were intentionally placing their dead in the Dinaledi Chamber, then a small-brained hominin was navigating a complex 3D environment from memory, coordinating group behavior around a stable, repeated practice, distinguishing group members in death from everything else in their world, investing energy and risk into a task with no immediate material return. You don't have to imagine hymns, prayers, or carved symbols on the walls for that to matter. It would still mean that rich mortuary behavior, something beyond mere accident, beyond simple natural processes, emerged in a lineage that does not look, on paper, like the obvious candidate. It would mean the roots of what we now recognize as caring for the dead run deeper and spread wider than we thought. But that's the if everything hangs on. Because each of these steps, from access to repetition to the suggestion of pits, can be challenged. Each can be reinterpreted in less intentional ways, and in a cave as complex as Rising Star, nature is very good at imitating order. To really test whether Homo naledi were intentional body placers, you have to grapple with those alternatives. Maybe you don't need root memory, maybe you need gravity, maybe you don't need repeated behavior, maybe you need a dangerous hole and bad luck, maybe you don't need burial pits, Maybe you need slumping sediments and wishful thinking. That's where the skeptics come in. If the case for intention gets its power from deep access, repeated deposits, and subtle patterning, the counter-arguments start from the same evidence and tell a very different story. The first counter-story is brutally simple. You don't need memory, tradition, or social rules if you can get everything you see in Dinaledi from one thing: gravity doing what gravity does. Imagine an opening somewhere above the chamber that we haven't found yet, or one that used to exist and later collapsed. A vertical shaft or a steep hidden chute, dark and narrow and treacherous. An animal approaches. Maybe it's chasing something. Maybe it's just exploring. Maybe it's pushed by others in a panic. It slips. It falls. It can't climb back out. It dies. Over thousands of years that could happen again and again. Not because anybody chose the Dinaledi Chamber as a special place, but because the geology of the cave made it a trap. This is the death pit model, not a cemetery, not a shrine, just a natural funnel. Supporters of this idea point to places like natural shaft caves in Europe and North America, where animal skeletons accumulate in huge numbers with no human involvement at all. Pit trap caves full of bears, wolves, deer, even hominins. You see multiple individuals, sometimes of different ages, all stacked in one deep, hard-to-reach place. You don't need anyone deciding where bodies go. You just need a hole that's good at catching living things and terrible at letting them out. If that's what Dinaledi was, then the big mystery suddenly looks smaller. 15 naledi individuals in one chamber isn't a ritual. It's just what happens when you run the tape for a few tens of thousands of years. So how would you test that? A real natural trap usually tells on itself. If bodies are falling in, you expect impact damage. Broken long bones, crushed skulls, shattered vertebrae. You expect individuals landing on top of each other, skeletons jumbled vertically with the deepest layers the oldest. You also expect variety, multiple species sharing the same fate. Antelopes, baboons, carnivores, maybe birds. In Dinaledi, the picture is mixed. On one hand, there's surprisingly little clear-cut impact trauma. A few fractures, yes, but not the systematic pattern you get from repeated violent falls. You also don't see the classic vertical stratigraphy of a long-used pit. The bones are more spread within particular sediment packages than cleanly stacked in time. On the other hand, we don't have a perfect understanding of every passage that ever existed above that chamber. Caves evolve, shafts collapse, openings seal, sediments infill. A trap that was open and deadly 250,000 years ago could be completely hidden today. And then there's the awkward fact that naledi dominate the chamber. There are some other faunal remains, but nothing like the mixed species carnage seen in classic pit traps. For some researchers, that combination, no clear shaft, limited trauma, strong taxonomic bias, weakens the pure, accidental fall model. For others, it doesn't kill it. It just nudges it toward a variant, not a clean vertical drop, but a difficult route that some individuals could navigate down but not back up. In that version, Homo naledi aren't tumbling like rocks. They're climbing, slipping, and maybe getting trapped in stages. An injured individual could drag itself into a sheltering recess and die there. A frightened juvenile could wander deeper in the dark and never find the way back. Over time, a hazardous passage system could quietly harvest unlucky explorers. You don't need group-level planning to get a cluster of bodies. You just need enough time and a consistently dangerous environment. The second big natural alternative swaps gravity for water. Caves are not static tombs. They breathe. Water moves through them, sometimes as gentle trickles, sometimes as powerful underground rivers. Flood pulses can sweep sediment, rocks and bones from one area into another. concentrating debris in low spots, a bit like a gutter grate on a city street gathering trash from an entire block. In this scenario, naledi bodies or skeletal remains fall or lie in more accessible parts of the system, near entrances, along slopes, on ledges. Then, during episodes of high water, pieces are eroded, washed loose, and transported down into Dinaledi. Over multiple events, the chamber becomes a kind of natural catchment for bones from elsewhere. If that's true, you'd expect signs of transport. Water that's strong enough to move bones is strong enough to leave a signature. Abraded edges on the skeletons. Long bones aligned in the direction of flow, fine sediments sorted by grain size, with clear layering from different flood episodes, bones of many different animals and parts mixed together in chaotic jumbles. Again, what we actually see is complicated. There are some signs of limited movement, bones that are slightly displaced from where you'd expect them if a body decomposed in perfect stillness, scattered elements that don't belong to the nearest articulated cluster. There are sediments that suggest minor water reworking, but the general picture isn't one of major fluvial chaos. Many bones are relatively well preserved, with delicate structures intact. Some hands and feet retain an astonishing degree of articulation. Whole anatomical regions seem to have sagged and settled rather than been swept away. That doesn't rule out water, but it shifts the story. Instead of torrential streams dragging whole bodies into the chamber, the data fit better with a quieter role for water, subtle rearrangement, not original delivery. Bodies, however they got into the chamber, could have decomposed more or less in place, and then occasional damp episodes smeared the edges, slumped sediments, and nudged bones a bit downslope. Water as editor, not author. Which brings us to the third familiar suspect, other animals. Predators and scavengers are bone architects. Hyenas, big cats, canids, raptors. They all move remains around, often in very selective ways. A carnivore might drag a limb into a den, chew off muscle and ends of bones, then abandon the shaft. Over time, one layer can end up full of particular skeletal parts and age groups, all from natural feeding behaviour. Some critics have argued that something like this could explain Dinaledi. Not the hyenas were hauling entire naledi corpses into the deep cave. There's no good evidence for a major carnivore den in that chamber, but that scavenger activity elsewhere in the system could fragment, redistribute and concentrate bones in specific places. Again, taphonomy is your guide. Large scavengers leave tooth marks, punctures, distinctive fracture patterns from powerful jaws. They often heavily damage joint ends and spongy bone, leaving dense shafts behind. Small scavengers and rodents etch gnaw marks and create tiny repeated notch patterns. In Dinaledi, such marks are rare at best. There are some potentially chewed edges, some breaks that could be interpreted as carnivore-related, but nothing like a robust assemblage of predator-altered remains. And crucially, no obvious layer signature, no mound of digested pellets, no thick carpet of mixed animal bones with strong age and element biases. That weakens the pure predator-did-it model, but it doesn't eliminate more indirect roles. Scavengers could have modestly disturbed bodies near cave mouths, changed which parts ultimately decomposed where, and set up the conditions for later water or gravity to act. All of this leads to a key concept that quietly haunts every Homo naledi argument: equifinality. Equifinality is a fancy way of saying different roads, same destination. In taphonomy and archaeology, it's the uncomfortable fact that very different processes can leave behind remarkably similar patterns of bones and sediments. Take a set of fairly complete skeletons in one chamber, with some articulation preserved, mere bones clustered in a confined area, limited sign of violent transport. You can get that from deliberate body placement in a protected space where decomposition happens in peace. You can also get something uncannily similar from a natural trap that catches entire bodies and keeps out large scavengers, with only minor water activity reshuffling the debris over time. Add subtle depressions in the sediment around some skeletons. Are those shallow pits dug by living hands, or small hollows formed as soft tissue decayed and underlying sediment compacted? Both processes can create basin-like shapes. Both can produce slight differences in fill texture and colour. Equifinality means that a neat pattern doesn't automatically have a neat cause. It forces you to ask over and over, is this evidence uniquely consistent with intentional behaviour, or is it merely compatible with it? That's why this debate refuses to die. Every natural explanation, accidental falls, entrapment over time, water transport, low-level scavenger activity has weaknesses when you confront the actual Dinaledi data. None fits every detail perfectly, but the intentional placement model has its own vulnerabilities. It has to explain why there aren't clearer-cut boundaries around alleged pits, why we don't see obvious grave fills or distinct repeated grave shapes, why a deep mortuary chamber contains so little in the way of obvious accompanying material culture. No clear tools left with the bodies, no unambiguous grave goods. So you get a stalemate of plausibilities. If you lean toward intention, you emphasize the access difficulty, the age spread, the articulation, the taxonomic focus, or the possible depressions. If you lean toward nature, you emphasize the incompleteness of the cave map, the known tendency of caves to concentrate remains, the power of subtle post-depositional processes to mimic order. Both sides are looking at the same bones. Both can tell coherent stories that fit large portions of the evidence. Neither can yet erase the other without remainder. And until you can point to a line of evidence that clearly, decisively refuses a whole category of explanations, this cannot be gravity, or this cannot be deliberate. Equifinality keeps the door open. It's that open door that makes Rising Star so contentious. Because if nature can assemble something that looks like a burial ground, then some of the most headline-grabbing claims about Homo naledi collapse into coincidence. But if nature can't quite get you all the way to what we see down there, then even the best natural scenarios leave a nagging residue of intention that has to be explained. To push further, you have to tackle an even harder question. If naledi really were making repeated trips into that dark chamber with their dead, how were they doing it? Literally, how were they seeing? You can't dodge that question by hand-waving about better night vision. Deep inside Rising Star, you are in a place where light does not exist unless something brings it there. The Dinaledi Chamber is beyond the reach of the entrance glow. You don't get twilight. You don't get let your eyes adjust. You get black. Your pupils can be wide open and it doesn't matter, just because fewer photons are hitting your retina in an hour than hit your phone camera sensor in a single frame. Now picture the route. However you reconstruct it, through the tight Superman's crawl, down the slippery chute, across broken floors, the way to Dinaledi is not a gentle ADA-compliant ramp. It's twisting, uneven, three-dimensional space, holes in the floor, low ceilings that split your scalp if you stand too fast, drop-offs that can break your legs. Try doing that without light, carrying a 40-kilogram body. The moment you take the burial hypothesis seriously, you inherit a logistics problem, not a vibes problem, a physics problem. If Homo naledi were repeatedly entering this specific deep chamber on purpose, you have to explain how they navigated and managed risk in an environment where a single misstep can maim or kill. There are only a few ways to solve that. One is memorization, a socially transmitted mental map of the cave, a sequence of movements drilled into bodies over years until they can be done almost automatically. Another is modification, physically altering the cave, smoothing surfaces, piling rocks, marking routes. But both of those, for deep chambers, usually sit on top of the fundamental solution almost every cave-using hominin seems to arrive at sooner or later. Fire. Archaeologists don't just assume fire because it feels human. They look for a very specific suite of signatures. Combustion leaves soot, fine black carbon particles that cling to ceilings, walls, and stalactites above flame level. Over time, repeated burning can leave visible smoke halos, darkened zones that don't match natural manganese staining or mineral bands. Then ash is another clue. Wood ash has a distinctive microstructure under the microscope. Fragile plant cell ghosts that survive for surprisingly long periods when they get buried quickly. Concentrated lenses of light, powdery material, oddly white or pale grey compared to surrounding sediment, can flag former hearths. Heat does strange things to cave floors. At the right temperatures, clay minerals change structure. Carbonates redden or recrystallize. Under thin-section petrography or infrared spectroscopy, you can pick out patches of sediment that have been altered by sustained burning, even if no visible charcoal survives. And then there are bones. Burned bone behaves differently from weathered bone. It shrinks. It cracks in particular patterns. It can turn blue-grey, then chalky white as organic components burn off and the mineral matrix reconfigures. If Naledi or anyone else were routinely using fire in Dinaledi, whether for light, cooking, or burning bodies, you might expect at least a few fragments of clearly heat-altered bone. So far, reports from Rising Star have mentioned soot-like deposits, charcoal flecks, and patches that some researchers interpret as possible burned sediment around the Naledi chambers, including Dinaledi. Others are more cautious. Caves are chemically busy places. Manganese and iron oxides can paint walls black without a single flame. Organic rich sediments can darken from slow decay. Tiny bits of charcoal can trickle in from surface fires and get washed into cracks. The argument quickly turns into a forensic puzzle. Is that ceiling film really soot? Or a natural mineral coating? Do those dark specks come from in situ burning, or were they introduced by water, roots, or much later human visitors? Are those subtle colour changes in the floor the signature of controlled hearths, or just the patchwork of a cave that has been wet, dry, and chemically altered for hundreds of thousands of years? If you want to argue for firelit mortuary journeys by Homo naledi, you need a pattern. Discrete clusters of burned sediment, repeated in similar positions, associated with naledi remains rather than random corners. Ideally with multiple independent lines of evidence, charcoal, heat-altered minerals, maybe even microstratigraphy showing ash layers laid down then trampled, then overlain by later deposits. We don't have that clean package yet. We have hints, claims, counterclaims. Preliminary analyses that suggest burning and critiques that question whether the data are robust enough, whether contamination and later human activity might have introduced misleading signals, which leaves an uncomfortable gap. Because if fire wasn't being built and sustained down there, how are deep cave visits working? One escape hatch is to decouple light from full hearths. You don't have to imagine a cosy campsite with crackling logs and roasting meat. Light can travel as embers, as sparks, as small, handheld torches that never get set down long enough to create a classic hearth signature. Think of carrying a slowly smouldering branch from the surface. It glows, it smokes, but it doesn't erupt into a bright flame unless you feed it air and fuel. Use sparingly. It can throw just enough orange to mark a drop-off. Pick out a foothold. Illuminate the contours of a body in your arms. That kind of use is much harder to detect archaeologically. A torch waved around a few times every year for centuries might leave only a faint soot wash on the high surfaces. Embers carried in and then extinguished quickly could leave micropatches of heated sediment barely distinguishable from natural chemical hotspots. If the same general route is used but the exact stopping points vary, ash lenses may be thin and dispersed. It gets more speculative from there. Could Naledi have used perishable light sources we scarcely imagine? Resinous roots, fat-soaked plant fibres, glowing fungus? Maybe. But most of those, if used at scale and frequency, would still involve combustion products. Smoke has to go somewhere. Then there's the no intentional light possibility. What if the critical movements happened while some exterior light still filtered weakly into parts of the system? Could twilight reach far enough that, with superb dark adaptation and tactile familiarity, Naledi could negotiate much of the route? Modern cavers will tell you, true deep zones are unforgiving. Once you cross certain bends and constrictions, surface light is gone. Your only options are artificial light or blind progress. Progress in genuine darkness is possible by touch, by memory, by following airflow or subtle temperature cues. But it's slow and dangerous, especially with loads. Imagine a chain of individuals, each with specific tasks. Scouts who know every bump, followers who move only when a leader taps a particular shoulder, bodies passed from hand to hand through tight squeezes. If that kind of choreography happened even once, it implies a level of social coordination that goes well beyond wander in and see what happens. And this is where light becomes a proxy for something bigger. Whatever solution you choose, fire hearths, carried embers, minimalist torches, rehearsed route memory in darkness, none is cognitively cheap. You don't accidentally evolve a deep cave mortuary system. If Naledi were using fire in Rising Star, it suggests mastery of ignition, fuel management, and combustion in confined spaces. They would have had to understand, even if only implicitly, that certain materials burn better than others, that smoke accumulates, that flames need oxygen. They would have had to transmit that know-how between generations, which plants to gather, how to pack them, when to light them, here who leads and who follows. If instead they were making repeated lightless or near-lightless trips, guided by touch and memory that may be even more demanding socially, the first explorers would have had to survive long enough to return and report. Routes would need to be encoded in behaviour, sequences of bends and drops, turned into stories, gestures, training rituals. Children would need to be introduced gradually, learning the path before ever being entrusted with a corpse. Missteps would be costly. The community would have rules about who goes down, when, how often. Either way, you end up with cultural scaffolding, skills and practices that don't live in a single brain for a single lifetime, but in the group, reinforced and refined over many cycles of use. The lighting problem, in other words, is not just about photons. It's about institutions. Do we believe a small-brained hominin could develop a shared tradition of cave use, complete with route knowledge, risk management, role differentiation, and maybe even a sense that this place down here is where bodies go? Some scientists look at the absence of unambiguous hearths and answer no. For them, the lack of strong fire evidence tilts the scales back toward natural accumulation models. If there is no clear repeated light source, then regular, purposeful, deep cave visits become implausible, and the bones start to look more like the byproduct of bad luck and complicated geology. Others flip the logic. They argue that even faint signals of burning deep inside a system like Rising Star are astounding. If confirmed, they would place controlled fire use, for illumination in tight cave spaces, in the hands of a species with a brain the size of a gorilla's. That would rip up neat correlations between brain volume and technological reach. And even without rock-solid fire evidence, they point to the simple fact that Dinaledi is not an easy stroll from the sunlight. However the bodies got there, something had to bridge the dark. Whatever bridged it, embers, torches, memory, or a mix, starts to smell a lot like taught behaviour. In that sense, the debate over light is really a debate over mind. Do you need our kind of mind to solve the dark? Or can a different kind of hominin, with a different brain plan, assemble enough cultural complexity to do the same job? That question only intensifies when you turn away from the bones and start looking up at the walls. Near the Dinaledi Chamber, on a smooth patch of soft rock, now there are lines, not cracks, not jagged chaotic fractures from collapsing stone, straightish, intersecting grooves, crosshatches, triangles, ladder-like shapes, some shallow, some deeper, some apparently superimposed over others. The team that works at Rising Star looks at these and says, these are engravings, deliberate markings made by Homo naledi, on purpose, with tools, hundreds of thousands of years ago. If that's true, it's explosive. Because this isn't a doodle scratch next to the cave entrance where you could just idly drag a stick while daydreaming. It's down in the same deep, difficult zone where the bodies lie. The same realm of total darkness you just walk through in your imagination. But as soon as engravings and symbols enter the conversation, so do the knives. Scientists who are very happy to entertain burial start to get uneasy. They ask, are we seeing intention, or are we seeing what we want to see? Carving a meaning into a rock is one thing. Projecting a meaning onto a rock is another. So how do you even begin to tell the difference? This is where archaeologists turn into pattern-obsessed skeptics. Natural rock surfaces in caves are scratched all the time. Falling pebbles, expanding and contracting minerals, water carrying tiny grains over centuries, animals clawing or rubbing against walls. Even modern boots, bags and equipment can leave confusing scuffs. If you want to argue engravings, you don't just point to lines and say, look, it's a hashtag. You start with the geometry. Are the grooves straight over their length? Or do they wander with the natural crystal structure of the rock? Do they intersect at consistent angles, like someone was aiming for a grid or a deliberate shape? Or do they meet at random? You look at spacing. Parallel lines that maintain a uniform distance suggest controlled movement. Natural processes tend to vary more. You examine cross-cutting relationships. Does one set of lines clearly overlay another, meaning someone came back and added more later? Or are they all indistinguishably old? Then you zoom in. Under strong magnification, an intentional engraving made with a stone tool or bone point has a characteristic profile. Often a V-shaped cross-section with fine striations running along its length, created by the tiny imperfections in the tool edge biting into the rock. Natural scratches from rolling stones or falling fragments have different textures. They can be more U-shaped, more ragged at the edges, less consistent from point to point. You also check for tool marks that start and stop. A human hand usually accelerates, then decelerates. So you might see the groove deepen in the middle and feather toward the ends. A rock tumbling in water doesn't care about that. Context matters too. If similar marks show up in many different parts of the system, in places where humans have obviously been walking, crawling, and hauling gear in the last decade, you have to entertain contamination. Maybe some of the neatest grooves are from a steel ladder, or a caver's harness, or a sampling tool dragging by accident. If instead, they're clustered in a hard-to-reach alcove that no one touched before careful documentation, and if the lines are under a film of ancient mineral deposit that modern scratchers don't have, that tilts you back toward antiquity, as the Rising Star engravings sit right in the middle of this minefield. Proponents point to overlapping line sets, consistent angles, apparent layering that suggests intentional composition over time. They note that some grooves cut through mineral coatings that, in turn, overlie older lines, hinting at a sequence. Mark, calcite builds up, mark again. Critics push back. The rock type is soft. Soft rock is notoriously easy to scratch and re-scratch. Water seeps, mineral films, and microfracturing can all create surfaces that look clean, but are actually geological palimpsests. A few photos and field descriptions, they argue, aren't enough. They want high-resolution 3D scans, micro-erosion studies, controlled comparisons with known natural and known artificial grooves from similar environments. Until that happens, engravings remain a claim, not a settled fact. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the marks are intentional, that an naledi hand, holding a tool, dragged it across the wall in a repeated, deliberate way. What does that mean? It doesn't automatically mean art. It doesn't automatically mean religion. And it definitely doesn't automatically mean fully modern human language with verbs, tense markers, and poetry. Symbolic behaviour sits on a spectrum. At one extreme, you have entirely utilitarian markings. Think of scratch tallies tracking how many times something was done, or simple route markers. Turn left at the triple line wall. Those marks are meaningful, but only in a narrow, practical sense. Further along, you get conventional symbols, shapes that stand for ideas that aren't physically present. A cross that stands for a belief system, a clan mark that stands for group identity, a spiral that stands for something we might never decode. Then, layered on top of that, you get full-blown visual representation, depictions of animals, humans, composite creatures, scenes. So where do rising stars' lines sit? If the patterns are real and ancient, they're geometric, grids, chevrons, crossing lines. That puts them in the same broad bucket as some of the oldest widely accepted symbolic traces on Earth. Think of the engraved ochre block from Blombos Cave in South Africa, just under 100,000 years old. Crisscrossed lines forming a hatched design, widely interpreted as deliberate and probably symbolic, because the pattern is regular, repeated on multiple pieces, and not an obvious byproduct of tool sharpening. Or the engraved shell from Trinil in Java, associated with Homo erectus, around 500,000 years old. A zigzag incised on a freshwater mussel shell. The lines are neat, evenly spaced, deeply cut. Many researchers cautiously accept that as deliberate marking, though what it meant is completely unknown. Closer to 30 or 40,000 years ago, you get a flood of cave imagery in Europe and elsewhere. Horses, bison, hands, abstract signs repeating across enormous territories. By then, arguments over whether humans were thinking symbolically are mostly over. Rising Star, if the engravings are genuine, would sit much earlier than most of this established record, and belong to a species with a much smaller brain than any of the artists people usually picture. That is why the bar is, and should be, so high. Because if you're going to claim that a small-brained hominin 500,000 years ago was deliberately incising recurrent structured patterns on a cave wall deep in a mortuary space, you are not just adding a footnote. You are rewriting timelines that have been cautiously built over decades. You don't get to do that on the basis of "it kind of looks intentional to me." You need replicable documentation, multiple independent teams examining the same surfaces, blind to each other's interpretations, high-resolution imaging, microscopic analysis to separate natural weathering microfeatures from tool-edge striations, clear stratigraphic arguments that place the creation of the grooves before modern disturbance. Only then do we even start to talk about symbolism, and even then we stay humble about what that symbolism implies. Because symbolic marking is not a switch that flips language on. Corvids and great apes understand symbols in lab settings. They can learn that a particular shape or colour stands for a reward. They can sometimes use arbitrary signs to communicate simple requests. But they don't have our kind of language ecology, open-ended, recursive, layered into myth and lore. A naledi engraving, if real, would tell us that they could associate repeated patterns with meaning. Maybe this niche is special. Maybe our group was here. Maybe this is the place of the dead. It would hint that they were capable of shared conventions, abstract enough that they had to be taught. That's staggering on its own, but it doesn't force us to believe they told origin stories by firelight or argued about metaphysics. Likewise, Most burial plus engravings doesn't automatically equal religion in the modern sense. It could indicate a structured set of practices and emotions around death. We put bodies here, we mark the place, we return. That's already more than most animals do. It's ritual in a broad sense. But whether those rituals came with explanations, afterlives, spirits, ancestors, we simply don't know. Which brings us back to that core issue that keeps surfacing in every part of the naledi debate. Extraordinary interpretations demand extraordinary evidence. Deep cave interment by a small-brained hominin is already extraordinary. Add intentional wall marking, interpreted as symbolic, inside the same space. Now you're stacking claims. Each layer has to be able to stand on its own. The bones must be shown convincingly, to have arrived through behaviour rather than blind geology. The fire traces must survive scrutiny as true in situ burning, not mineral accidents or recent contamination. The engravings must pass every test for intentionality we can throw at them, from microscopic profiles to spatial patterning. Only then is it reasonable to float the bigger picture. A species with a gorilla-sized brain, moving dead companions into the depths, guided by light or memory, leaving marks on the walls as part of that practice. For some researchers, that picture is irresistible. It fits with a broader movement in paleoanthropology that has been steadily dismantling simple brain-size hierarchies. Clever Neanderthals, innovative Denisovans, technologically adept Homo erectus. Why not add symbol-using naledi to the cast? For others, it feels like too many leaps at once. They argue that human history is already weird and rich without multiplying miracles. If natural processes plus a little later human or animal disturbance can explain the bones, the charcoal, the lines, then that's the safer bet until ironclad evidence forces us elsewhere. In that sense, the marks on the walls are less important for what they might mean to naledi, and more important for what they reveal about us. How ready are we to loosen the grip of our own intuitions about who gets to be symbolic? How tightly will we cling to existing timelines, and how rigidly will we enforce evidential standards? Because if Homo naledi really were carving meaning into stone next to their dead, the implications don't stop with them. They roll forward, directly, into our ideas about what a small brain can do, and into the question that hangs over every bone, every soot smear, every disputed groove. What kind of mind are we actually dealing with here? To get at that, we have to leave the rock walls for a moment and stare straight at the brains themselves, or rather the empty spaces where brains once were. When you first see a naledi endocast, the internal mould of the brain case, it doesn't scream mystery of consciousness. It looks small. Not bird small, not mouse small, but in hominin terms, modest. Somewhere in the chimpanzee to early Homo erectus range. Around a third the volume of a modern human brain. If you've grown up with the story that intelligence marched hand in hand with brain size, this should be the end of the conversation. Big thoughts need big hardware. Little skull, well, little mind. Case closed. Except, the last few decades of research have been quietly dismantling that neat equation. Brain size correlates with a lot of things. Body size, metabolic cost, the need to track complex environments. Across broad evolutionary scales, bigger brains do tend to show up in lineages that do complicated stuff. But that doesn't mean you can rank minds the way you rank engine displacement in cars. It doesn't mean there's a magic cubic centimetre threshold where symbolism switches on and funerals become possible. And Homo naledi lands right on the fault line between those two ways of thinking. For a long time, paleoanthropology leaned heavily on what you might call the threshold model. Somewhere along our lineage, brains cross a certain size, maybe around 1,200 cubic centimetres, maybe a bit less. Before that, you have pre-modern hominins, clever, sure, but locked out of true symbolic behaviour. After that, you get us and our close cousins: language, art, ritual, long-term planning. It's a simple story. It lets you draw a line. Naledi sabotages that. Here's a species with a brain volume in the 450 to 600 cubic centimeters range, depending on the individual. Yet the surrounding context, if even some of the rising star claims hold, looks at minimum organized. Bodies are not scattered at random across a landscape. They're collected in a particular place. That place is hard to get to. The pattern repeats. You can respond in two ways. One is to protect the threshold, to say, there must be a mistake. The dates must be wrong. The chamber must be a natural trap. The engravings must be modern contamination. Anything, really. Yeah, that lets you erase intentional, repeated, deep cave body placement from a small-brained species. The other is to ask whether the threshold itself was ever real. Because outside of fossils, we already live in a world where small brains do surprisingly big things. Take corvids, crows, ravens, jays. Their brains are not just physically smaller than ours, they're wired differently, more densely packed, fewer cortical layers. Yet some corvids can plan multiple steps ahead to get food, use tools in sequence, even resist immediate rewards to get better ones later. Tasks that, for decades, were used as benchmarks of higher cognition. Octopuses have even stranger brains, spread partly into their arms. They can solve puzzles, open jars, escape enclosures, remember specific keepers. When bored, they sometimes blast water at lights to short them out. No cortex, no primate heritage. Still, unmistakably, problem solvers. Even within mammals, brain size doesn't map neatly onto mental life. Dogs have smaller brains than wolves, but outperform them on reading human social cues. Some small-brained monkey species navigate complex social hierarchies and recognize dozens of individuals by face and voice. The point isn't that naledi were as smart as corvids or octopuses in some unit-for-unit comparison. The point is that cognition is not just about raw volume. It's about wiring, organization, and, crucially, the environment that brain is embedded in. Which brings us to an alternative to the threshold model, cultural scaffolding. In this view, what looks like advanced behavior is often less about an individual performing miracles in their head and more about groups building mental structures outside of anyone's skull. Think of a human child. On their own, they can't survive. They can't cook, can't make tools, can't navigate a forest or a city. But drop that same child into a culture, give them adults to imitate, language to absorb, norms to follow, and their world explodes in complexity. They learn to write, to count, to play instruments, to obey traffic signals. No single neuron in their brain understands what a legal system is, but the group does. The group creates institutions, stories, rules that scaffold the child's thinking. A lot of what we call intelligence rides on that scaffolding. Once a practice exists in a group, say, putting bodies in a particular place, it can be learned and repeated by individuals who don't understand every reason behind it. You don't need to reinvent burial from scratch every generation. You just need to be born into a world where this is what we do when someone dies. Birds give us a hint of how far this can go without massive brains. Some species develop local dialects of song that are passed down culturally, not genetically. Young birds learn the local pattern by hearing adults. If a new variant catches on, it can spread through the population like a meme. Chimpanzees do something similar with tools. One group uses sticks to fish for termites. Another, living in a nearly identical environment, cracks nuts with stones. The difference is not in genes, it's in learned tradition, observing, imitating, practicing. As none of these animals has a human-sized brain, yet they build little pockets of culture, local ways of doing things that accumulate over time. Now scale that up to a hominin that walks upright, has hands free for carrying, manipulates fire, makes stone tools, and lives in stable social groups. You don't need Homo sapiens level language to get surprisingly complex behavior. You need stable traditions, long juvenile learning periods, and a social environment where we matters as much as I. Naledi, from what we can tell, checks many of those boxes. They had small brains, but those brains were not generic. The shape of their endocast suggests reorganization, areas associated in modern humans with planning and social cognition appear relatively expanded compared with some earlier hominins. Their teeth and hands hint at a life of mixed foraging and dexterous manipulation. Their feet look built for long-distance walking. In such a creature, social intelligence is not an add-on, it's the operating system. Living in groups is cognitively expensive. You have to track relationships. Who owes whom? Who helped last time? Who might turn on you? You have to read cues, posture, gaze, vocalizations. You have to anticipate conflict, navigate alliances, soothe tensions. Primatologists sometimes talk about the social brain hypothesis. The idea that many primate brains got big not for tool-making but for dealing with each other. If Naledi were deeply social, and the density of bones in certain parts of the cave hints at group life and group death, then a large fraction of their mental energy was likely devoted to social worlds. That matters for something like burial. You don't have to postulate full-blown theology to explain repeated body placement. You can start with social emotions, attachment, grief, aversion to the smell and sight of decay, concern about predators being drawn to camp, a desire to keep group members, even dead ones, within some boundary that feels safe or meaningful. Out of those ingredients, a practice can emerge. When someone dies, we take them over there. Do that once, it's an event. Do it 10 times, it's a pattern. Do it for generations, and it becomes custom, weighted with emotion and memory. Young individuals grow up watching the process. When their turn comes to carry, they already know the route. None of this requires an individual naledi to sit down and reason. We, as a species, now engage in symbolic mortuary behavior that expresses our conception of personhood and the afterlife. It just requires a group life that is stable enough and a learning environment rich enough to transmit a tradition. That's the core of the cultural scaffolding idea. Brains don't have to individually carry the full complexity of behavior. The group offloads some of that complexity into routines, shared spaces, material traces, a path worn into cave floor, a pile of stones at a particular bend, charcoal smears that mark where light has always been kindled, grooves on a wall that people know as the place. In this framework, cognitive thresholds look less like cliffs and more like staircases. Stepwise increases in the ability to imitate, to remember, to coordinate attention with others, to maintain shared focus on something that isn't immediately useful. Once you're high enough on that staircase, you start to see what anthropologists call cumulative culture, behaviors that not only persist, but build. Tools that become slightly more refined each generation, routes that become more efficient, rituals that acquire extra steps. We see early hints of cumulative culture in many animals. We see it explode in our own lineage. The question Naledi poses is, how early on that staircase can you already get practices that look, from a distance, like burials? There's another angle too, convergent behavior. Even if Naledi were interring their dead in a deep chamber, that doesn't necessarily mean they were like us in some full psychological sense. Animals sometimes converge on similar behaviors for different underlying reasons. Elephants have been observed touching and revisiting the bones of their dead. Ravens and magpies sometimes place grass or twigs on carcasses. Some primates remain near deceased infants for days, carrying or grooming them even as they deteriorate. These acts are not burials, but they're not nothing either. They show that social animals can respond to death in ways that look structured, even ritual-like, without needing human-style metaphysics. So when we imagine naledi moving bodies into a dark chamber, we have to be careful. We might be seeing convergent solutions to social and ecological problems. Emotional bonds plus aversion to corpses plus available cave equals this specific repeated behavior cluster. The behavior is still remarkable. It's still outside what we usually attribute to small-brained hominins, but it might not be a miniature version of human religion. It might be something that evolved along its own path, under its own constraints. This is, in some ways, the most unsettling idea of all. Not that only big brains bury their dead, not that any behavior that looks like ours must mean a mind like ours, but that there could be multiple ways in evolution to arrive at pockets of complexity, group-level, tradition-driven, emotionally charged practices that leave traces in the ground, carried by beings whose internal experiences we can't fully reconstruct. Homo naledi forces us to entertain that. Either our models of brain size and behavior are too rigid, missing how much work culture can do to amplify a small brain, or our interpretation of the rising star evidence is overshooting, reading too much into patterns that could, in principle, be generated by a mind that is complex but not human-like in the ways we expect. In both cases, the old comfort that you can just eyeball a cranial capacity and decide what kind of inner life went with it falls apart, and that has consequences far beyond one cave in South Africa. Because if a brain the size of a gorilla's might live inside a web of tradition, rich enough to produce practices we'd call ritual, then all of our diagrams of cognitive revolutions and behavioral modernity start to look less like straight arrows and more like tangled overlapping threads, threads that cross, threads that double back, threads that vanish into gaps in the fossil record, which brings us back to the uncomfortable present. We're staring at small skulls and scattered bones, trying to decide how far we're willing to stretch our picture of ancient minds. Do we redraw the line between simple and complex, or do we double down on caution and demand impossible levels of proof before we let naledi into the club of symbol-using species? That tension between expanding the circle and guarding the gates is exactly why, a decade after their discovery, the case of Homo naledi is still very much open. And it's why, even with all the spectacular finds from Rising Star, science is still hesitating at the doorway of that dark chamber, uncertain how far to step inside. If you feel that hesitation, that's not a bug. It's the system working. Because for all the drama around Homo naledi, we're missing some of the most boring, unsexy, absolutely crucial pieces of evidence that would normally settle a debate like this. Think about what archaeologists lean on when they talk about graves. In later sites, you'll often see a clear grave cut, a pit dug into pre-existing sediment, edges crisp enough that you can trace the outline in a profile. You'll see the backfill, the material used to fill the pit after the body was placed, looking different from the untouched layers around it. Sometimes you can even see individual shovel scrapes in the microstratigraphy. In Rising Star, we don't have that level of clarity. The sediments around the naledi bones are disturbed, yes. They're mixed in ways that suggest something happened there besides quiet, undisturbed accumulation. But they're also in a cave environment where water, slumping and tiny shifts can blur boundaries over time. The alleged grave zones don't show a smoking gun trench that every geologist and archaeologist who looks at the section agrees is a deliberate pit. Some experts see subtle, human-made hollows. Others see natural depressions and sediment flows being reinterpreted through the lens of a desired story. Same with the bones themselves. For a textbook burial, you might expect relatively complete skeletons, articulated joints, bodies lying in the positions in which they were placed. In Rising Star, some individuals are more complete, others are fragmentary. Some bones look like they decayed more or less in place, others could have shifted. There are no obvious tooth marks from scavengers, which is intriguing. But there also isn't a single, pristine, knees-to-chest individual wrapped in a clear outline of dug sediment that everyone can point to and say, that's the grave. Dating is another soft spot. The current age estimates, around 230,000 to 330,000 years for some of the bones, maybe younger or older for others, are based on a mix of methods. Uranium-thorium dating of flowstones, optically stimulated luminescence of sediments, relative positioning of layers. None of that is unusual. Deep-time archaeology always involves stitching together different techniques. What is unusual is how contested the sequence is. Some researchers argue that flowstone layers must be younger than the bones beneath them, locking in a minimum age. Others counter that flowstones can intrude into older voids, or that blocks can move, making the relationship less straightforward. The end result? We're not arguing over a neat single date. We're arguing over a range, a sequence, an order of events, and small changes in that sequence can have big consequences for how implausible or plausible repeated body placement becomes. Then there's the question of light, arguably the most intuitive sticking point for many people. If naledi were moving bodies deep into these chambers, they needed illumination. Fire is the obvious candidate. The Rising Star team has reported charcoal, burnt bones, and blackened surfaces they interpret as soot and heat alteration. If those traces are unequivocally ancient and securely associated with naledi, the story that they used fire inside the cave becomes hard to resist. But unequivocally is doing a lot of work there. Caves are notorious for being visited and revisited. A single, later occupation can smear charcoal over surfaces that formed much earlier. Tiny amounts of carbon can move. Without airtight microstratigraphic context, this charcoal is in this layer that caps this bone that we know is this old. Critics can reasonably ask whether some of the fire evidence might come from later hominins, or even from modern intrusion. So far the traces of burning are suggestive, but not universally accepted as naledi-made beacons in the dark. Layer on top of that the debated engravings on the walls, grooves and cross-hatched patterns some interpret as deliberate symbols, others as natural cracking plus wishful thinking. And you start to see why "case closed" is not a phrase you'll find in the more cautious papers. This is what scientific disagreement looks like up close. It's not just people shouting "yes it is" and "no it isn't." It's people interrogating methods. How exactly were the sediments sampled? What resolution were the thin sections taken at? What calibrations were used on the dating instruments? Are there blind tests where someone who doesn't know the right answer interprets the stratigraphy or the engravings? Have independent labs run the same measurements on the same samples and come back with similar results? Replication matters. So does peer review, but not in the popular sense of a wise committee handing down a final verdict. Peer review is more like the first serious stress test. A study goes out, other specialists poke at it, question assumptions, try to apply the same methods to other sites. New data come in. Hypotheses bend or break. Sometimes they survive. Sometimes they get replaced by something that fits the total evidence better. And beneath all that, there are competing frameworks quietly shaping what counts as plausible. If your mental model says symbolic burial is a late rare achievement of big-brained Homo sapiens and their immediate cousins, then any claim of ritual behavior in a small-brained species has to climb a very steep hill of proof. If, instead, you're comfortable with the idea that group traditions and emotional responses can generate surprisingly structured behaviors earlier, you might be willing to live with a bit more noise in the data, same bones, Same dirt, different priors. Out in the wider world, those subtleties get flattened. The story that travels is rarely, teams of scientists are engaged in a protracted debate over sedimentology, taphonomy, and the cognitive implications of mortuary practices. The story that travels is tiny-brained human buried its dead, or extraordinary burial claims don't hold up. Attention rewards confidence. The headlines like oldest burials in the world get more clicks than complex depositional history in a South African cave raises intriguing possibilities. A dramatic press conference, a documentary, a book deal, these can put one interpretation far out in front of the slower, quieter process of consensus building. Critics look reactionary, defenders look embattled. The public sees a fight, not a negotiation. And yet, underneath the noise, the actual work keeps going. Teams are still mapping unused branches of the cave system. Rising Star is almost certainly not fully explored. New chambers could exist, some containing more naledi, others showing different patterns of deposition that either reinforce or undermine the burial hypothesis. Dating techniques continue to improve. Methods that weren't practical a decade ago, like higher resolution uranium series mapping across tiny flowstone crystals, or better luminescence protocols that can handle complex light exposure histories, could tighten the age ranges, link specific bones to specific episodes of sediment movement, and disentangle overlapping events. Microstratigraphy, the painstaking study of microscopic layers within the sediments, can reveal whether bones settled slowly into place, were washed in by pulses of water, or were deliberately placed and then covered. Different processes leave different textures. If future thin sections show sharp boundaries consistent with pits being dug and refilled, that would be a major strike in favour of intentional burial. If instead they show gradational water-laid structures with dispersed fragments, the natural trap scenarios gain ground. We also don't yet have the full cast of characters. The more individuals we find, the clearer the pattern becomes. Are bodies clustered in certain age ranges or sexes, hinting at social rules around who gets placed where? Do we find traces of trauma, disease, or cause of death that might explain group losses? Do other chambers show similar accumulations, or is this one truly unique? On the biochemical side, better collagen preservation or other molecular traces might one day allow finer genetic work, confirming whether these individuals form a single, tightly knit population or a mix of different groups over time. That, in turn, would shape how we think about repeated use of the same chamber. All of that is possible. None of it is guaranteed. Caves are stingy. Time is cruel. Even some questions may never get the crisp courtroom-style answers we crave. So we're left in an awkward place. On one hand, the convergence of clues, isolated chambers, repeated presence of one species, lack of scavenger damage, possible fire traces, maybe even engravings, feels too structured to shrug off as a random catastrophe. On the other hand, each line of evidence has enough ambiguity, enough room for alternative processes, that turning "this might be deliberate treatment of the dead" into "this is the earliest confirmed burial tradition" still feels like a leap. The tension isn't going away anytime soon. Every new paper, every fresh analysis, seems to push the needle one way, then the other. A compelling argument for intentional behaviour is followed by a careful critique of the dating. An exciting interpretation of wall marks is met with a reminder of what water and rock can do on their own. And in that back and forth, Homo naledi sits in the dark, stubbornly refusing to resolve into a simple story. Maybe, in 10 or 20 years, new data will tilt the balance decisively. We'll look back and wonder why anyone ever doubted that a small-brained hominin could organize its dead. Or we'll decide that the cave's complexity fooled us, that what looked like ritual was a mirage woven from erosion and chance. For now, though, we live inside the uncertainty. The evidence is strong enough to disturb our old categories, but not clean enough to rewrite them without debate. The grave is too old to make easy sense, the brain too small for our expectations, the chamber too complicated for tidy diagrams. Science, as standing at the edge of that darkness, hasn't closed the case. It can't, not yet. But that open file, that unresolved puzzle, may be the most important part of the story, because it forces us to ask what we're really looking for in the bones of another kind of human, and what it would mean for us if the answer never comes wrapped in certainty. So let's sit for a moment with the question that started all of this. If Homo naledi really were putting their dead into that chamber on purpose, again and again, over generations, what were they feeling? What story were they telling themselves in the dark? It's tempting to jump straight to the grand answer. Grief, love, ritual. A blooming, buzzing, symbolic world in which death already meant more than an empty body. And maybe that's right. Maybe the act of carrying a lifeless form into a deep, dangerous space was powered by something we'd recognize instantly. The refusal to just leave someone you knew to rot where they fell. But there's another possibility. Maybe it began as something colder, more practical. Bodies attract predators. Bodies smell. Bodies are a problem. In a cramped cave system, you can imagine a group deciding that one chamber, hard to reach, tucked away, was the place to put the problem. A hygienic dump site, a safety measure. No symbolism required, except even that story doesn't stay simple for long, because once you do the same thing many times, in the same way, for reasons no one remembers clearly anymore, it stops being just logistics. It becomes tradition. This is where we put them hardens into this is where they belong. Children grow up watching adults disappear down a particular passage with the dead and come back without them. No one has to explain much. The cave itself is now part of how the group understands loss. Somewhere along that spectrum, between raw emotion and blunt practicality, between we can't leave them here and we always take them there, Homo naledi might have lived. Maybe there were individuals who felt a sharp ache when they walked into that chamber, who hesitated before turning back. Maybe others treated it like any other task. Maybe the same person felt both things at different times. We don't know. We might never know. What we do have is the pattern. Bodies, one species, one place. And here's where the mystery turns back on us. Because when we look at those bones and insist on one explanation, pure ritual, pure hygiene, pure accident, we're revealing more about our own need for neat stories than about what actually happened. The Naledi cave system is asking us to hold multiple possibilities in our heads at once, without rushing to flatten them into a single headline. It might be care, it might be caution, it might be the slow crystallization of a rule that no one ever stated out loud. It might be all of those at once. This is one of the quiet gifts of the rising star debate. It teaches us that being cautious with our certainty doesn't mean shutting down wonder. You can look at that cramped, twisting passage and say, we don't yet know exactly why those bodies are there, and still feel your skin prickle at the thought of small-brained humans stepping into total blackness, carrying their dead. You can let the doubt stay on the table and still be moved. In a way, that's the mystery we inherit. We're the species that asks these questions, that digs up old bones and argues about taphonomy and symbolism and brain size. And at the same time, we're the species that stands in front of a grave, any grave, and feels something that doesn't fit neatly into a data table. When we wonder about Naledi, we're also wondering about ourselves, about when, in our deep past, death stopped being just an event and started being a relationship that continued after the heartbeat ended, about how much of what we call being human depends on big brains, and how much depends on something smaller and harder to measure, a stubborn tendency to care, to remember, to repeat. Maybe Homo naledi were nothing like us inside. Maybe they were closer than we're comfortable admitting. Right now, the evidence draws a blurry outline and then steps back, leaving us to fill in the rest with hypotheses, with experiments, with stories. That's the work ahead. More cave surveys, better dates, finer sediment slices, new finds that either sharpen the picture or complicate it further. The odds that we'll get a single, cinematic answer are low. The odds that we'll keep learning surprising, humbling things along the way are very high. If you've stayed with this story all the way into the dark, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your country or city, and tell me what you think. If naledi really did carry their dead into that chamber, what do you imagine was going through their minds? If this kind of deep time mystery is your thing, there's a whole book of prehistoric secrets waiting for you. You can read more and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. It dives into other strange moments like this, when the past refuses to line up neatly with our expectations. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, it really helps if you tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. That lets me keep wandering through the deep past with you, following these fragile trails of evidence into places where certainty runs out and curiosity has to take over. Somewhere, 300,000 years ago, a different kind of human walked into the dark for reasons we can only guess at. We don't know exactly what they were thinking, but the fact that we're still asking might be the clearest sign of who we are.